They say in Georgia, when the wind moves wrong across the cane fields, you can still hear it, the sound of man's last breath, dragged through a crushed throat. No voice, no scream, just the wet snap of bone and the whisper of air trying to live. It happened 9 times. 9 men, masters of the land, found with their necks caved in like hollow reeds. And every witness said the same thing. They saw a giant, 7 feet tall, standing silent in the moonlight. He didn't speak. He never screamed. But when his work was done, the fields fell quiet, and the air itself seemed afraid to move. In the sweltering summer of 1821, the Dawes plantation sat on the edge of the Ogeechee River, 20 miles west of Savannah. 1,000 acres of rotting sugar cane stretched into the horizon like broken teeth. It was a place where the ground drank blood and never gave it back. The Dawes family had ruled that land for 3 generations. Men who believed God had placed them above creation itself. Their fields were worked by over 100 slaves, their bodies stripped by the sun and their souls eaten by silence. Among them was a new purchase, a giant unlike any they had seen. His name was Jacob, though the papers called him property. No one knew where he came from. He was delivered in a steel cage, his wrists too thick for the shackles they tried to bind him with. Jacob never spoke, not when he was whipped, not when they branded him. He just looked, eyes like river stones, still and black. The overseers said his quiet was unnatural, that he could make a man feel naked just by watching. On his first night, the dogs wouldn't go near him. The hounds whimpered and clawed to be let back inside. The sky was heavy with thunder, but no rain fell. In the morning, they found one of the dogs dead, its jaw broken, its tongue torn out. No one saw it happen. But from that day, the Dawes plantation called him Big Jacob the Silent, and the fields began to whisper. It started small, murmurs in the slave quarters, prayers muttered too softly to hear. The older women said the silence around Jacob was unnatural, that he carried something inside him, something old, something that didn't need words to speak. The slaves avoided his shadow. They said it pulled at the soul like a current. A few of them claimed to see figures moving when he was near, faces in the corner of their eyes, shapes that melted into the cane. The overseers noticed it too. When Jacob walked through the fields, even the birds went quiet. The air thickened like before a storm. One night, a man named Elias, who'd once been proud of his whip, decided to test the giant silence. He cornered Jacob near the drying sheds and struck him across the face, once, twice again. Jacob didn't move, didn't blink. Elias laughed, spat, and turned away. By dawn, they found him lying in the same spot, eyes open, mouth wide, his neck twisted backward, crushed inward like clay. No one saw Jacob do it. No one ever would. But the next morning, the cane grew darker, thicker. The slaves swore the plants had fed. And somewhere in the distance, a new sound began, not a scream, but a faint, wet rattle, as if the wind itself was choking. By autumn, the Dawes family was breaking apart. Master Eli Dawes, the second son, began waking in the night, gasping for air, clawing at his throat. He told his brother that something stood at the foot of his bed, a tall, still figure, watching him breathe. He tried to pray, but the words never reached his mouth. That morning, Eli was found on the floorboards, neck caved in. His eyes bulged with terror, his body drenched in sweat. The local doctor said it was a seizure, but no seizure crushes bone. The plantation hands said it was Jacob's curse, that every man who laid whip to his back would soon choke on his own breath. They began to whisper that Jacob was not born of woman at all, but made, something conjured from old African rites, a spirit of vengeance bound in flesh. The Dawes patriarch, Reverend Ambrose Dawes, refused to believe it. He gathered his sons, loaded his pistols, and made for the quarters. They found Jacob kneeling in the dirt, head bowed, eyes closed. The Reverend put a gun to his skull and told him to speak, to confess what he was. Jacob only stared, and in that silence, the Reverend's youngest son began to tremble. He said he heard voices, hundreds of them, whispering behind the giant's eyes. That night, the family buried 2 more sons. By now, the slaves no longer called Jacob a man. They called him the Breathtaker. News of the Dawes' death spread through Chatham County like disease. The local church, St. Solomon's Chapel, declared the plantation cursed. The county minister, Father Reese, rode out to cleanse the land with prayer and holy water. He brought a mirror, an old European relic, said, to reveal the shape of a sinner's soul. They gathered in the great hall. Jacob stood in chains, surrounded by men with rifles. Father Reese demanded that the giant look upon his own reflection. When Jacob lifted his head, the glass cracked, not from impact, but from within, as if it couldn't bear what it saw. Witnesses said they saw something move inside the reflection, a shadow, stretching, swallowing light. Father Reese dropped the mirror, screaming that the man was no man at all. Later that night, they found him hanging in the chapel, tongue blackened, eyes rolled white. The mirror lay in shards below him. Each piece held a fragment of Jacob's face, but not one of them was the same. The plantation's crops rotted. The workers vanished, and Jacob remained chained in the barn, unmoving, unbreathing, until the next full moon. The night it ended, or began, the moon was red as a fresh wound. The Dawes family gathered what was left of their men, armed themselves, and marched to the barn. They said the air was vibrating, like the hum of a great engine beneath the earth. When they opened the door, Jacob stood waiting, still chained, still silent. Then, without a sound, the chain split. The iron snapped like twigs. No one remembers what happened next. Not clearly, but the screams that followed were said to last hours. When dawn came, 9 men lay in the dirt, throats crushed, eyes frozen wide. The barn was slick with blood. The fields were silent. Jacob was gone. Only a trail of massive footprints led into the cane, and then stopped halfway through the field, as if the giant had simply walked out of existence. In 1843, 22 years after the Dawes massacre, a group of men from Savannah arrived at the overgrown ruins of the plantation. They were historians, they claimed, sent by the state to catalog forgotten estates. But the real order came from the Bureau of Ethnological Research, an obscure government office that specialized in unusual cases of human origin. They brought shovels, notebooks, and rifles. The place was wild again, vines climbing over rotted beams, the air thick with decay. Every step they took sank into soft, wet ground. Within an hour of digging, they found bones, dozens, maybe hundreds. But the skeletons weren't all the same. Some were too long. Some had ribs fused together, spines warped, skulls with extra sutures like something was reshaping human form. Among them, one grave was different. It was 7 feet long and sealed with iron nails. Inside, a rib cage twice the width of a normal man's, and vertebrae that looked crushed inward, as if the body had been folded by impossible strength. The men panicked. Their leader, Dr. Thaddeus Crane, ordered the bones burned and all notes destroyed. But one man, a field assistant named Henry Lyle, kept a fragment of the skull, a relic shaped like an open mouth. He took it back to Savannah, and that's when the nightmares began. Henry Lyle began to suffocate in his sleep. His wife said she'd wake to find him sitting upright, gasping, clutching his throat. He swore he could hear someone whispering in the dark, not in words, but in the rhythm of breathing. When he tried to sell the skull fragment to a collector, it shattered in his hands. A gust of air filled the room, and every candle went out at once. 3 days later, Lyle's neighbors broke down his door. He was found in bed, mouth open, eyes wide, ribs cracked inward. No sign of a struggle. The only mark on him was a faint handprint on his neck, too large to be human. After that, the Bureau sealed the Dawes file. Official cause, viral respiratory failure. The remains were dumped into the Savannah River. But one photograph survived, a blurred image of the 7-foot skeleton, its skull crushed in one place. The jaw, written beneath it, in ink faded to brown. The Silent One. In 1870, a priest named Father Augustine Marrow began studying what the church called cases of unholy silence. He found references to Jacob's story buried in the archives of St. Solomon's Chapel, listed as incident number 44, the silent slave of Ogeechee. The file contained a single sentence, written in Latin. He was made to carry the silence of 9 tongues. Father Marrow believed Jacob was part of a forgotten ritual, an experiment in spiritual inversion. Some missionaries in West Africa had reported similar breath rituals, where silence was not absence, but a weapon. The priest traveled to Georgia to investigate. Locals refused to speak to him. They said the land was still cursed, that livestock died if you prayed aloud after sunset. In the ruins of the Dawes barn, Marrow found symbols burned into the wood, circles of ash and a handprint that seemed pressed from inside the wall. He took rubbings, sent them to Rome, and waited for response. 2 weeks later, the Vatican courier arrived, but the envelope was empty. That night, Marrow wrote one final entry. I have heard the breath in my room. It is not wind. It waits for me to speak. He was found the next morning with his throat collapsed. The church sealed his records and renamed the case file. Sermo Mortuum, the speech of the dead. By the 1920s, whispers of Big Jacob had become folklore, the giant who spoke without sound. But in 1928, a young psychologist named Dr. Evelyn March uncovered something impossible. While working at the Georgia State Asylum, she documented 7 patients who suffered identical recurring dreams. Each one described standing in a field of cane while a tall, dark figure watched them. They all woke, gasping, claiming their breath had been stolen. March found their stories traced back to families who had lived within 20 miles of the old Dawes plantation. None of them knew each other. None had ever heard of Big Jacob. Her notes grew frantic. She wrote, "The silence infects through memory. Those who imagine him begin to dream him. Those who dream him begin to feel him." On April 3, 1929, Dr. March was discovered dead in her office. The cause of death? Asphyxiation. But there were no bruises, no trauma, only a look of absolute terror frozen on her face. In her desk drawer, investigators found a reel of tape, silent, save for one faint sound. A slow, steady breathing, rhythmic, measured, as if someone enormous was standing very close to the microphone. After Dr. March's death, the Georgia State Archives launched a quiet internal purge. Dozens of documents vanished overnight. Files related to the Dawes plantation, the silent slave, and psychological contagion, oral hallucination phenomena, were destroyed. But one man, archivist Samuel Price, made copies. He believed he'd uncovered proof of an early psychological control experiment run jointly by the church and the Bureau in the early 1800s. Price's letters describe something chilling, a theory that the plantation's slaves were being used as vessels, conduits for testing a way to transfer obedience through silence. A perfect control mechanism. Jacob, he wrote, was their greatest success, a man stripped of voice, filled with command. Price sent the documents to a journalist in Chicago. But before they could be published, his home burned to the ground. All that survived was a single charred page, the ink warped but still legible. He did not kill because he wanted to. He killed because they taught him how to listen. And beneath that, drawn in ash, a 7-fingered handprint. In 1887, deep beneath the ruins of St. Solomon's Chapel, a work crew unearthed a sealed chamber. Inside lay 13 wooden tablets, preserved in wax, and inscribed in a mix of Latin and an African script the linguists couldn't identify. The church quietly seized the artifacts, but a single Jesuit scholar, Father Esteban Luca, managed to translate fragments before they vanished again. He called them the Gospel of the Mute God. The text spoke of a being called Ngoloma, he who breathes for the dead, a god of silence, worshipped not through prayer, but through restraint of sound, where each withheld breath was an offering. According to the gospel, silence was not emptiness. It was possession. To be silent was to open one's body to something greater, something that could inhabit you through your breath. Father Luca traced the cult's history from the Congo to Charleston, carried across the Middle Passage by enslaved priests hidden among the cargo. The rites were said to be used to create mute guardians, beings who could listen to the will of the divine through the quiet of others. When Luca compared his translations with the Dawes plantation reports, he wrote, "The pattern of deaths is liturgical. Each crushed throat mirrors the vow of silence. Each death is a hymn. 2 days later, Luca went missing. His study was found emptied, his manuscripts gone. Only one note remained on the wall, written in his own blood. He is still listening. In 1901, a secret meeting convened at the Savannah Diocesan Office, attended by representatives of both church and government. The topic, residual silence phenomena. Records recovered decades later show that the Bureau believed Jacob's existence proved the potential for obedience through inhalation stimuli. The church, meanwhile, believed silence was a doorway to the demonic. They argued for days, science versus sin, until a deal was made. The church would provide theology. The Bureau would provide test subjects. That same year, 12 men and women disappeared from the Georgia State Prison farm. None were ever found. But years later, a doctor's ledger surfaced with one chilling entry. Subjects exhibit symptoms of reversible suffocation. The silent state is stable. The breath no longer belongs to them. Witness accounts say the experiment was conducted inside a derelict cotton mill. The building was later condemned, its walls lined with thousands of handprints pressed outward from the inside, as though a multitude had tried to escape. Locals still call it the House of Air. And every year, when the humidity rises, they say you can hear breathing in the empty corridors. In 1916, a sharecropper's boy named Josiah Bell was found wandering near the Ogeechee River, barefoot, trembling, unable to speak. When questioned by police, he wrote 3 words in the dirt. He came back. Doctors diagnosed him with traumatic aphonia, a rare psychological loss of voice. But when they examined his throat, they found something stranger, muscle scarring consistent with crushing pressure, as if an enormous hand had closed around his neck without breaking the skin. Josiah's family swore he'd been working near the ruins of the Dawes plantation. They said he'd gone to look for relics to sell. When authorities searched the site, they found an open pit lined with black stones and animal bones arranged in a spiral. In the center was a single human vertebra, too large for any man. Josiah was institutionalized for life. For 40 years, he never spoke a word. But every night, guards swore they heard him humming, low, rhythmic, like the sound of breath echoing through a long, hollow tunnel. The asylum chaplain, before resigning, described it best. It wasn't music. It was something trying to learn how to breathe again. By 1932, the legend of Big Jacob had become a forbidden curiosity among occult circles. A group calling themselves the Quiet Ones formed in New Orleans, a secret order of theologians, former priests, and ex-intelligence officers. Their leader, Madame Corinne Duval, claimed to possess a lock of Jacob's hair, sealed in wax. She said it pulsed when the moon was red, that it still breathed. The Quiet Ones believed Jacob was not destroyed, only asleep, a living vessel for the silence itself, buried beneath the earth until the world was loud enough to need him again. Their writings described the breath ritual, a ceremony designed to awaken him by recreating the conditions of the Dawes massacre. 9 men in a circle, 1 to speak, 8 to hold breath. In 1933, 9 members of the group were found dead in an abandoned church outside Baton Rouge. Their throats were collapsed inward. A 10th member, the only survivor, was found mute, having carved a phrase into the church altar with his fingernails. He stood behind U.S. The case was closed under gas inhalation. But the coroner's report noted one final detail. The bodies were still warm, hours after death, as if something was breathing through them. In 1949, decades after the last known death, a classified memo surfaced in Washington, D.C., titled simply Project Invert. It described attempts to weaponize the phenomenon of silence, to replicate Jacob's psychic effect through low-frequency sound deprivation. The goal, psychological submission through resonance of the breath. The experiments failed. Test subjects either lost speech permanently or turned violently on their handlers, crushing throats in mimicry of Jacob's victims. One scientist, Dr. Paul Henley, recorded his findings on real tape before disappearing. The last minutes of the tape contain his terrified whisper. "It's not sound we fear. It's what fills the space when sound is gone. Soon after, the project was dissolved. Files were shredded. The Dawes Plantation was flooded under a new government reservoir. But even underwater, fishermen claimed to hear things. Faint breathing rising through the surface when the lake was still. Locals refused to cast lines near the spot. They said the giant was still waiting in the dark, listening for anyone foolish enough to speak his name aloud. In 1957, 30 years after the Dawes land was flooded to form Lake Ogeechee, fishermen began reporting strange phenomena. Their boats drifting without wind, lanterns flickering out, and a deep, rhythmic thumping rising from beneath the surface, like a heartbeat too slow to belong to anything alive. At first, local authorities dismissed the stories. Then the bodies began washing up. Each corpse bore the same signature: neck crushed inward, lungs collapsed, no water in the airway. The victims had drowned without drowning, suffocated in open air. A state diver named Marcus Wind volunteered to investigate. On his second descent, his tether snapped. The radio caught fragments of his last transmission. It's open a door into the silt. It's not rock, it's bone. Then static. His body was never recovered. But his helmet was found days later, caved in from the inside. The pressure marks matched human hands. After that, Lake Ogeechee was declared off-limits. Yet some nights, when a mist is low, locals say you can still see bubbles rising in slow, steady rhythm, as if something below is breathing again. In 1973, a team of university researchers conducted unauthorized acoustic studies at the lake. They recorded 24 hours of ambient noise from the water surface, using sonar and hydrophones. When they played back the tapes, most of it was silence, except for one segment. A sound barely audible beneath the static. A deep, slow inhale, followed by a faint groan. When analyzed on a spectrogram, the sound wave formed an impossible pattern. A human silhouette, 7 feet tall. Lead researcher Dr. Alan Keene became obsessed. He isolated the frequency, looping it night after night in his lab. Within a week, his colleagues found him dead, slumped over the playback machine, eyes open, throat crushed. The tape continued spinning, the room filled with static. Later analysis revealed something chilling. The recording contained no low frequencies. The breath had not been heard. It had been felt. After Keene's death, the university sealed the files. The reel was labeled Ogeechee_001, do not play aloud. In 1992, a documentary crew from Atlanta sought to film an episode on Southern folklore. They interviewed residents around the lake, recording stories of the giant in the deep. On the third night, they camped by the shore. At 2:17 a.m., the camera picked up movement, ripples spreading outward in perfect circles as though something massive had risen below. The audio went silent for exactly 9 seconds. Then came a single sound, a long, drawn-out exhale that rattled the microphone. The camera fell. What followed was chaos, screams, splashing, the sound of running, then nothing. The footage was recovered the next morning, half buried in mud. The crew was never found. Frame by frame, investigators noticed something impossible. In the final seconds, as the camera tilts upward, a silhouette can be seen standing waist-deep in the water. 7 feet tall, head bowed. Still, the tape ends with a whisper. He's listening again. By 2005, Big Jacob the Silent had become an urban legend, the kind of horror told in online forums and midnight podcasts. But one corner of the internet, known as the Silence Network, took it seriously. Members shared recordings, photos, and local reports of similar deaths. Crushed throats, muted screams, lungs collapsed without injury. Cases appeared across Louisiana, Alabama, and the Carolinas, always near water, always on nights when the moon was red. One user, posting under the name The Archivist, claimed to have stolen files from the Bureau. He uploaded a scan of an old government seal marked Sermo Mortuum, reopened 2003. The document contained one short statement. Subject reconstituted. Residual silence detected in atmospheric frequencies below 18 Hz. Recommend containment. Within 48 hours, the silence network disappeared. Every account deleted, every file erased, but cached fragments of the forum still exist. The last post reads, "Do not listen for him. He listens back." There are nights in Georgia when the air grows too still, when even the crickets stop and the moon turns the water to glass. That's when they say he moves again. Not walking, not swimming, just listening. Modern engineers call it low-frequency anomaly. Meteorologists call it thermal inversion. But the locals who still remember the old stories, the Dawes name, the vanished priests, the drowned divers, they call it by one word: Jacob. No one speaks his full name anymore. Not because they fear him, but because they've begun to understand what silence really is. It isn't emptiness. It isn't peace. It's the space left behind when something ancient listens for its next command. They say he was born from cruelty, built out of pain, obedience, and blood. But what if he was never just one man? What if Big Jacob was the first shape taken by something far older, something that learned how to use silence as flesh? Because it's still spreading. Doctors now call it sleep paralysis. Psychologists call it night terror. But every case begins the same way. You wake. You can't breathe. In the corner of the room, there's a shadow taller than any man, just standing there, waiting. And when you finally scream, when the sound breaks your throat, that's when you understand what all those men, priests, and scientists never did. The silence never belonged to him. It belonged to us. And it's coming home.